Hello, everyone. It's Mr. Huffman, and today we're going to be moving right along into industry. I know that's exactly what you wanted to hear about today, right? You woke up this morning, you're like, I want to hear all about industry, right? Well, first of all, calm yourself. Okay. Second of all, um, hopefully you're doing well wherever you are. Thirdly, finally, okay, let's do it. Let's get into industry. Okay. So, I mean, we've been talking about really the Industrial Revolution that had happened earlier in the 19th century, right? In the first few decades of the 1800s, Great Britain, France, a lot of the major European nations start to industrialize. The United States isn't super far behind. The North, in particular, industrializes at a much higher rate. Of course, that gives them all the advantages when it comes to the Civil War. But by the end of the 19th century, industry is not just concentrated in the North, it started to go all across the country, out further south, but also into the West. And it's really going to be how the United States makes some incredible gains all across modes of industry. That really greatly benefit the United States tremendously, not just here at home, but slowly as we're going to start building our own kind of international cachet and international influence. Industry plays a very crucial role in that. Okay, so again, there was that industrial revolution of the early 1800s, but for the most part, America's still a nation of farmers. That mostly in the United States is an agrarian society where family farms and even larger farms are really the norm, and industries mostly located still in the early days of the 19th century further north. And out of 30 million people that lived in the United States in the early 1800s, only about 1.3 million worked in industry prior to the Civil War. So that's, just over 1/30th of the whole population is working in factories or in industry. That's going to start to change, though, as the war ends. Mines and especially factories are going to start replacing small family workshops. And what that basically means is that you maybe had kind of a small little hat maker, a haberdasher, you would call them. Haberdasher, say that 5 times fast, right? Basically, a little local hat maker. They would specialize in making hats. But all of a sudden now you have a huge factory that can employ all these various people to make hats. And so it kind of puts some of these small mom and pop places out of business, but in the service of creating these much larger factories. And again, mines also had a big role in that too, as far as the West. And so they're using large, complex machinery, big buildings that have lots of people working for them. Again, this is going to be big in the North, but even in the South and also even further into the West. And so by the late 1800s, by the century's end, the U.S. is actually the world's leading industrial nation. For the longest time, Great Britain had held that crown, but now the United States passes them to become the leading industrial nation. And by 1914, that's right as the First World War is about to break out across the world. The gross national product of the United States is 8 times greater than it had been in 1865 by the time of the war's end. So over the course of about 50 years, the United States has grown this gross national product by 8 times, which just shows you over a relatively short amount of time, the United States industrial base is much, much larger than it had been prior to or at the very end of the Civil War. Okay, what are some of the reasons for this rapid growth? Well, for one, natural resources. I mean, if you're talking about the sheer scope and geography of the United States, we have so much more land to glean all sorts of resources from, such as timber, coal, iron, copper. All that stuff that's just waiting in the ground or above the ground is just, we're just have so much more of that than a lot of these other smaller European nations that really don't have a whole lot to work with. So they're having to go abroad and kind of create colonies in Africa as well as in Asia to try to get a lot of those resources that they're lacking in their much smaller nations. But the United States, however, again, we know how big the United States is. We have many more natural resources to choose from. So that certainly is going to be a huge aid to industry. And what that means is that if there's so much of it, the supply so high, that means the demand's low, which means that the prices can be relatively cheap. And so we don't need to import them from other countries, much like, again, Europe was doing at this time. They were having to import a lot of their stuff from colonies in Africa or colonies in Asia. So one big resource that the United States had plenty of was petroleum. And this was highly in demand because They don't have cars just yet in terms of gasoline or converting that into gasoline. But kerosene is going to be the way that the United States starts to light itself in terms of having lights in your home, lights in businesses. Kerosene is going to be the main, source of that light. And as America is starting to be lit up, America is going to start to change in a whole variety of ways, right? Electricity is right around the corner. We'll be touching on that here actually just in a little bit. But before that, kerosene is going to be the way that America starts to light its homes, light its businesses, lights all manner of public and private life. Okay, so kerosene is going to be hugely in demand, and the United States has a huge resource in terms of its supply of petroleum. Also, the United States has a much larger workforce in many ways than some of these other nations. Between 1960 and 1910, over that roughly 50-year, half-century period, the population of the United States actually triples. Now, we do have some immigrants that are starting to come over. That plays a role. But it's not just the immigrants. Even beyond that, the birth rates of the American citizens are going up as well. So between immigrants coming over, birth rates are kind of going up. The workforce is certainly going to triple over that 50-year period. And in general, that means if you have more people that are living, naturally that means there's more consumer goods that need to be made, which further adds to industry, right? So more people are living, which means we need more consumer goods, which means that's more business, more factories, you name it, a time of great considerable growth. As I said, immigrants, large families are starting to immigrate to the United States during this time. About 17 million come between that period of about 1860 to 1910. That certainly plays a role. And in general, and we'll touch on with we get into the progressive era, the turn of the century, people advocating for better conditions. In general, living conditions are starting to get better, which means more people are living and surviving into adulthood, which means you have more people who are then going to need consumer goods. That means you need more people to work in factories, so on and so forth. The United States is just growing at a seemingly exponential level from the end of the Civil War all the way through really the beginning and through most of the 20th century. So the United States, it goes without saying, rapidly growing. We have all these resources. We have all these people. We have all these needs. And so that just really adds and blooms and mushrooms. One of the big reasons why the United States is becoming the greatest industrial power, again, because of all these needs and innovations that we have service. And in terms of inventions, also, you're going to have a lot of prominent American inventors come about during this time. Why? Well, for one thing, the increased national productivity is happening, right? Improved transportation and communication networks. So the railroads are getting better. Telegraphs are getting better. Phones are also right around the corner, which means that all these new industries naturally are going to be benefiting from that, which are naturally, again, producing more wealth and more jobs for all manner of Americans. And so, again, big guy here, Alexander Graham Bell, he's going to be a Scottish immigrant. He had come over from Scotland, come to the United States, and other people had this idea as well. What if we could take the technology of the telegraph, which allows us to send messages back and forth, again, a very primitive form of text messaging, that dominated much of the 19th century. What if we could take some of that technology, but actually have it where we can hear one another through some sort of device, right? And so this talk by telegraph, he's going to really experiment with this through most of the 1870s, work exclusively on it for 2 years, and succeeds in 1876 when he creates the world, not just America, the world's very first telephone. As you can imagine, this revolutionizes business and personal communication, right? That you could be, not too many, not too far away from somebody, but instead of sending them a telegraph or sending them a letter or personally walking down there to talk to them, you could literally pick up this new device and talk to them instantly, right? We kind of take that for granted today, right? Now we can kind of snap anybody, we can FaceTime anybody, right? Instantly, right? But it goes without saying, at this time of the turn, late 19th century, this was a huge deal. The fact that you could talk to someone who is not in the room that you're in. That, frankly, that's still a big deal, really, to think about the technological leaps of that. And so this revolutionizes not only personal communication, but also business. It makes business all the more efficient. So you can kind of coordinate deliveries, deals, you name it. Businesses can now talk to one another, and that really streamlines the process of the economy and the process of delivery and so on and so forth. Now, it should be said that it's going to not really be until the early 1900s or early 20th century where the phone lines are built all across the country and everybody can have access to the telephone. That's not quite here just yet, but the early goings of it are still going to wrought kind of some considerable economic change and economic development. And it is going to be Bell who organizes the Bell Telephone Company, which eventually becomes American Telephone and Telegraph Company, otherwise known as AT&T, a corporation still very much around even now into 2021. Okay, another huge pioneer you may have heard of who's going to be an important late 19th century, early 20th century figure is going to be Thomas Edison. And he really is going to, take the lead in terms of being the leading pioneer in all manners of new technology, not just in the United States, but all across the globe. And in particular, he has a laboratory park in Menlo Park, New Jersey, which really is the forerunner of modern day research labs, which basically means you can patent an invention almost every month for the next first 5 years, is what Edison is able to do. That him and his team are kind of working at such a high pace that think about this, almost every month for the first 5 years of this kind of research lab, they are patenting a new invention, at least one, sometimes multiple ones, right? Meaning that they're working at an incredible clip when it comes to innovating all manners of technologies. In 1877, he rises to prominence with the phonograph, and he also is going to be perfect the electric generator as well as his biggest thing, the light bulb. And he's going to also go on to create the battery, the dictaphone, motion pictures, even themselves. A lot of that innovation comes from the mind of Thomas Edison. Him and a lot of people that worked under him that didn't really get the credit that they deserve, but he basically kind of ran these research labs and said, okay, if you come in here and I'll let you have a little space in my laboratory, and whatever you come up with, it's going to be owned by me, Thomas Edison, right? So a lot of hardworking people who we don't know their names exactly worked under Edison, kind of came up with these great inventions, and then he passed them off as his own, either officially or unofficially, right? And in 1882, he is going to start supplying electric power across the city of New York, which naturally, once electricity's entered into the fold, society is going to be very much permanently changed for the better, I would say, right? That now we don't have to necessarily totally rely on kerosene. Now we can have objects run on electricity, which means now America, on a much larger level even than kerosene, is starting to light up in significant ways. And in 1889, several of his companies are going to kind of form and create the Edison General Electric Company, which was later become General Electric, or GE, yet another company that is very much still with us now in 2021, right? So AT&T, GE, they have their roots going all the way back to these days of the late 1800s, the late 19th century. And again, Edison, he was a brilliant guy. He was a smart guy, don't get me wrong. But also, he was known for stealing other people's ideas, passing them off on his own, and he certainly got rich from them. Other people, not so good. You may have heard of the guy Nikola Tesla before. Tesla also made some huge developments when it comes to alternating current, AC current, and he isn't as widely known as Thomas Edison, certainly wasn't as successful as him, and they were huge rivals at this time. Edison ultimately won that battle, again, through a lot of dirty deeds and, dirty dealings and cutting and cheating people out of money that they were owed. Nonetheless, he does create a lot of things that were incredibly important, especially with regards to electricity. Another huge name, this time, George Westinghouse. He creates the air brake system for railroads that can be applied all at once on railways at the same time. Because in the past, if you wanted to brake on a railroad or a railway, you had to kind of individually brake the cars, which means that you got to brake this car naturally that's going this way before you brake this car. Because if you don't, then you're going to have them hitting one another. And so there was railway travel, while it was pretty, you know, widespread during this time, could also still be incredibly dangerous. So something like an air brake system that allows all the cars to brake at the same time is going to make railway much cheaper, much safer, and also you can travel now at much higher speeds without having to worry about braking. So now that trains can brake more rapidly and smoother, now all of a sudden trains can run quicker, which means that the American society is becoming all the more efficient. And Westinghouse is also going to help develop alternating current. Tesla was also one of these innovators, like I said, around this time, assisted by Tesla here, to distribute electricity to transformers and generators, which is kind of, again, he's a little bit of a rival of sorts with Edison. They're both working on electricity. And Westinghouse Electric Company is going to light the Chicago World Exposition in 1893, which was incredibly important in terms of showcasing the World's Fair. It was basically a World's Fair being held in Chicago, where people from all around the world were seeing, oh, look at all these new innovations that America is putting forth. And electricity was something that we were getting ahead of our kind of European brothers and sisters across the sea, across the Atlantic. And so all these kind of dignitaries and important people had come to Chicago and were amazed. Wow, this city is lit up by electric light. That was a huge innovation and really was proving to the rest of the world, hey, the United States is not far behind Europe. Europe still considers themselves the top of the heap in terms of economy and industry and all that. And so the Chicago World's Fair was a chance for the United States to not only to assert to the rest of the world, hey, the United States is catching up with you, Europe. It was a chance for us to boost our own self-confidence with regards to how our industry and our economies are growing quite seriously. The Westinghouse Electric Company also was the very first to use hydroelectric power, using the power of the Niagara Falls to generate electricity for streetcars and lights in Buffalo, New York, which was a whole 22 miles away. Which, again, this is crazy to think about now even, but it's certainly at the time even more so, that you could take the hydroelectric power of the Niagara Falls and fuel a city 22 miles away like Buffalo, right? That just shows you that we're making incredible strides when it comes to electricity, when it comes to harnessing the elements and turning them into hydroelectric power or electricity. So really the biggest theme in some ways of so much of this innovations of this era are all around electricity, how electricity is changing American society, again, literally lighting up American society, but also lighting up multiple light bulbs, figuratively speaking, of not only Edison, but many others say, oh, now if we have this energy source like electricity, where does it stop, right? We can just keep expanding and going on and on and on and really make this the wave of the future, so to speak. Some other quick, inventions and innovations I want to touch on. Thaddeus Lowe, he invents the ice machine, which is basically the basis of the refrigerator shortly after the Civil War. So now we can refrigerate food, freeze food, and keep food fresher for longer. That's going to be a huge thing, right? Clothing in the mid 1800s, the introduction of the Northrop loom, automatic loom, allowed cloth to be made at a much faster rate. Bobbins can now be changed automatically, and bobbins were the kind of little devices in the looms that kind of kept them going. So now that can be changed at a much faster rate, now you can kind of get more clothing is now producible during this time, which means that standard sizes are now being made and making ready-made clothes. Because before that, you usually had your clothes tailored to you specifically. Now you can get like shirts, like I'm wearing a large shirt here, right? I bought from Old Navy many years ago, right? That you can have, okay, this is a small size, this is a medium size, this is a large size, right? It's a chance for you to kind of actually have these ready-made clothes that you can kind of buy off the rack that aren't necessarily made tailored explicitly to your body type in the way that tailors had been in the past, but it's going to make it more easily available to buy clothes that way. And by 1900, a lot of specialized cobblers, and cobblers were people who made shoes, were starting to disappear because you're having people in these factories make shoes, standardized shoes similar to small, medium, large clothing, what have you. Same thing's happening with shoe sizes, which means that some of your local small town cobblers are unfortunately going out of business. In 1866, Cyrus Field, yet another innovator, is going to lay a telegraph line across the Atlantic Ocean, which was a huge feat during that time, which means now we can kind of communicate from, say, New York City to London or New York City to Paris, right? That all across the Atlantic Ocean, we can now instantly communicate with Europe, which was yet another huge innovation, right? Because before that, you had to worry about sending letters back and forth or whatnot. Now we can communicate via telegraph line and certainly eventually telephones. That's going to be more complicated. That's going to happen. So we can start communicating not just here in the United States, but with the rest of the world at a much faster rate than had previously been imagined. So, what's the kind of key thing uniting the nation other than these telegraph lines and slowly but surely these telephone lines? Railroads. Okay, so in 1865, about 35,000 miles of railroad track was laid in the U.S., almost all concentrated east of the Mississippi River. But by 1900, about 45 years later, 35 years later, my math was wrong on that, more than 200,000 miles had been laid. So already 35,000 miles was quite a bit, and most of that was just in the eastern part of the country. But now, by the end of the century, the turn of the century, 1900, more than 200,000 miles had been laid, which just shows you how exponentially larger that had gotten. And a big part of that really comes down to the Transcontinental Railroad, which was the railroad that was built basically to connect the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. And it's going to be mostly enabled by two major corporations in the hopes of speeding up and encouraging a healthy competition between these two companies. On one hand, you had the Union Pacific Railroad, which is pushing westward from Omaha, Nebraska, so it starts over here in Omaha, pushing further west. Who's building this? Civil War veterans are certainly going to be a part of this. Also, a lot of Irish immigrants who landed on the East Coast and are moving a little bit further west to work on this railroad, and a lot of them didn't have a lot of job prospects. So they said, well, we can work on the railroad. That'll help us out. Okay. Certainly frustrated farmers, miners, and some of those boom towns that I mentioned that they maybe become ghost towns. The miners had, maybe the mines had dried out and communities had moved elsewhere. Oh, maybe I'll work on the railroad now, right? Same thing happened with some farmers, cooks, adventurers, in some cases, ex-convicts, people who were looking that maybe led life of crime in the East, maybe trying to go west to start their lives over, right? Camp life in these areas was very rough. It was dirty. Gambling took place, hard drinking, fighting with their fists, and in some cases with their pistols. So that's the case for the Union Pacific Railroad. Meanwhile, there was the Central Pacific Railroad. This is the railroad going west to east. This is starting in California and moving further west. And the goal is we're going to connect these 2 points. And this doesn't show anything here about all the kind of eastern railroads that go across here. And so the Central Pacific Railroad pushing eastward from Sacramento, California, and they hire basically 10,000 workers, mostly from China. So you also have all these Asian immigrants who are arriving on the West Coast. China especially has a lot that are coming over. And they're getting paid $1 a day, which is not all that great. They should have got paid more. But for some of them, it is actually a kind of an upgrade from not having a job, period. And so that was a way for some of them to try to encourage their own economic mobility, right? So rails, cars, locomotives, machineries were all shipped from the East Coast around kind of South America all the way to the coast here on the West Coast and basically all that machinery's moved over there, and slowly but surely they're working their way across California, also across Nevada, all the way into Utah. So the goal is, again, that both of these railroads are being built at the exact same time. Again, the Union Pacific Railroad, they're going to be, I'll use your side to make a little more sense. Union Pacific Railroads, mostly Irish immigrants. Meanwhile, the Central Pacific Railroad, coming from California, is going to be more Chinese immigrants. And the goal is to meet in Utah, and then your Transcontinental Railroad will be finished. So again, Union Pacific, that's going to be mostly these Irish immigrants. And think of it this way: it's coming from the east, so the Union, kind of Civil War happened in the east. The Union won that. The Union Pacific. Meanwhile, the Central Pacific, Central China, Chinese immigrants, I should say, and also California, C. Hopefully, this will help you remember. Central Pacific from west to east, Union Pacific, um, east to west, and is mostly Irish immigrants. Okay, and there's a photo of part of that. And again, it goes without saying, in some of these cases, they're cutting through these mountain ranges. They're going through pretty treacherous, tough territory to see these 2 points meet. Okay, so believe it or not, that only took about 4 years, which is an incredible feat. That distance of building something that ambitious only took about 4 years to complete. It finishes on May 10th, 1869. Hundreds of spectators meet in Promontory Point, or Promontory Summit, or Promontory Point, Utah, to celebrate the joining of these railroads. Telegraph operators alert the rest of the nation, which is a huge celebration. Wow, you can now connect the East Coast and the West Coast by a rail line, right? And it might take several days, if not several weeks, to cross across the country, but that is still a huge innovation that now that railroad is complete. Now, there are going to be lots of other railroads that are built as well, but this was a huge endeavor and a huge success by the United States government, which naturally means that now that we've linked the nation via railways, markets are also going to be increased by an incredible amount, right? So now you can have all sorts of varieties of products that also are going to stimulate the economy. A lot of these products that are being kind of created are then going to be used in the construction of these railroads themselves. Steel. That's going to be a massive thing. You need steel to build the railways. You need steel to build the railroads. We'll talk about where that mostly comes from in the future. Coal, timber, all of these parts and components that go into the railroads, you're going to also, those industries are certainly going to be benefited during this time, which means that hundreds of a lot of smaller, unconnected railroads are built before a lot of the large rail lines came in and bought them out and took them over. And no guy was more successful at this than Cornelius Vanderbilt. Okay, he's the most successful railroad consolidator. He began his career actually in shipping. He shipped stuff across the Atlantic Ocean and elsewhere. In New York is where his base of operation was. But he then expands a little bit further west and builds in Chicago. He takes up a huge chunk of change there. And so if you're aware of the Biltmore Mansion or the Biltmore Estate, his grandson, George Washington Vanderbilt, I believe is his name, George Vanderbilt. His grandson was actually kind of one of the wealthy. Well, the Vanderbilt family in general was one of the wealthiest families at that time in America. And his grandson actually built the Biltmore House. If you've never been, I'd encourage you to go. It's beautiful. It's got a lot of great history of things at this time and then a little bit in the future, things I'll be touching on in terms of the Gilded Age. So Cornelius Vanderbilt, again, made his fortune in shipping, specifically with boats, but then eventually in railroads. And he was really adept at kind of buying a lot of these smaller railroads and then kind of saying, okay, I own them now, and kind of amassing this massive fortune that was on par with anyone else in the country, most certainly even the world. Okay. One last thing here I'll say about railroads or railways before I finish. Is they actually lead to the creation of time zones, because the American Railway Association splits the country into all these various time zones in 1883 and says, okay, this is the Eastern time zone, Central, Mountain West, and then also kind of the West Coast. And so time zones are going to be brought about because it's easier to coordinate basically the railways as a result of that. Okay, so time zones are created to help facilitate and schedule and plan and coordinate the railways or the railroads. So that's a huge innovation that we're very much still living with, right? So that's going to do it for today. This is Mr. Huffman signing off. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out to me and ask. Hope you take care. God bless, and take it easy.